Okay, let's begin our webinar. So thanks to all of you that are attending today. This is the 8th Fenix Infrastructure webinar, and it is about using ICEI resources for processing personal data. I'm Nicoleta Chiapidou from the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, and I will be hosting the webinar today. Our speakers are Boris Orth and Anne Nam from the Jülich Supercomputing Center. And the structure of the webinar is that after this short introduction, our speakers will do their presentations. Afterwards, we will have a Q&A section. So for anyone that has any questions, feel free to send them in the chat feature of Zoom, or you can click on raise hand so I can unmute you and ask a question out loud. And in the end, I will conclude the webinar with a few final slides. Just to let you know that the webinar is being recorded, so that you're aware, and the full recording file and the presentation slides will be uploaded soon after the webinar on our Fenix website, and the relevant links will be sent to you by email in any case after the webinar is done. So that's my short introduction. I will stop sharing my screen now and I'll give the floor to Boris. And Boris, you can share your screen and start with your presentation when you're ready.
I will. Thank you, Nicoleta. Let me share my screen. Very good. Then, yeah, so thank you for the introduction, and welcome everyone to this Fenix webinar, in which we would like to give you an overview of the ICEI resources that can also be used for the processing of personal data. And we want to talk about how this can be done. Before we start, I would like to clarify the terms Fenix and ICEI respectively, because this sometimes leads to confusion. Fenix is the name of a consortium of the 5 supercomputing centers in Europe, namely Barcelona Supercomputer Center in Spain, the CEA in France, GDPR in Italy, CSCS in Switzerland, and the Jülich Supercomputing Center at the Jülich Research Center in Germany. And you can see them here on the map of Europe. And these 5 centers have joined to build an infrastructure that is also called Fenix. And this is currently done within a joint project called the Interactive Computing E-Infrastructure for the Human Brain Project, or ICEI, or as we often call it, ICEI for short. This is co-funded by the partners in the consortium and the EU under a specific grant agreement under the framework partnership agreement of the Human Brain Project. So, in short, the 5 Fenix partners together build the Fenix infrastructure, and this is carried out currently within the ICEI project. For the agenda today, we're going to start with a general introduction to the protection of personal data. It is not a fully general introduction to the GDPR, but we will define some relevant terms and give an introduction to the basic principle of personal data processing on the Fenix infrastructure. And then Anne will guide you in detail through the process in ICEI that you need to follow if you would like to use the Fenix infrastructure for storing and processing personal data. And then at the end, she will also give you an example of such a project. And of course, in the end, as Nicoleta already said, you also will have the opportunity to ask your questions. So let's start with the introduction. Through the ICEI project, Fenix provides basic computing and storage infrastructure services for the HPP and eBrains, and also for other communities. And the different services that Fenix offers will not be covered in this talk in detail, but you can find them here at this link together with other details as well. There are some quite important use cases that require the processing of personal data. This is the motivation here, and Anne will, in the end of this presentation, give you an example that involves UK Biobank data to illustrate this. There is, of course, when personal data is involved, a need to ensure appropriate protection of that data. And since the Fenix partners that provide ICEI resources are distributed across EU member states, as I said before, and also Switzerland, the question is, what is the legal basis here? And as you probably all know, the legal basis is the General Data Protection Regulation of the EU that you can find here under this link. This applies across the EU, and as you also know, Switzerland is not part of the EU, but it has been recognized by the EC as providing adequate protection. So with the GDPR being the legal basis, let's talk about the relevant terms here. There are quite many defined in the GDPR, of course, but I'll stick to the most relevant ones. What is personal data? Personal data is any information relating to an identified or an identifiable natural person, and that person is then also called the data subject, where an identifiable natural person is one who can be identified directly or indirectly, in particular by reference to an identifier such as a name, an identification number, or other identifiers. One important concept that is relevant also within Fenix, for reasons that you will see shortly, is pseudonymization, where pseudonymization means that the personal data can no longer be attributed to a specific data subject without the use of additional information, which is typically done, or a simple example of this is that you just replace the names of the data subjects in your data set by IDs or numbers, and then keep the mapping of these numbers to the data subjects separate from the actual data. So that's actually important, that there's a separation between the actual data and the additional data that is needed to do the re-identification. The GDPR has a section in the beginning which has a lot of whereas clauses or recitals, and I would like to highlight two of those here. First, personal data which have undergone pseudonymization should be considered to be information on an identifiable natural person. And second, the explicit introduction of pseudonymization in this regulation is not intended to preclude any other measures of data protection. And I think it is very important to realize that pseudonymized data is still personal data falling under the GDPR. And as the second point here says, it may in general require additional measures of data protection So meaning in addition to just the pseudonymization. And it's usually the data protection officers who then decide on which other measures of data protection are required. Some more important definitions. First, data controller. A data controller is the natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or other body which alone or jointly with others determines the purposes and means of the processing of personal data. So that's the controller. And then there's also the role of the processor. That's a natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or other body which processes personal data on behalf of the controller. And in the context of Fenix, the sites as infrastructure service providers will always be the data processors. Whereas typically organizations that apply for Fenix resources will act as data controllers. I should remark here that in the future, eBrains platform service providers may also act as data processors and not data controllers. But this will require a suitable contractual framework involving the relevant Fenix sites, organizations offering eBrains services, and eBrains users. So let's get a bit more specific regarding Fenix. Within Fenix, 4 different classes of data have been defined, where class A is data sets that contain information relating to an identified data subject. So where basically for all the data, it is clear who the data subject is. Class B is data sets containing information relating to an identifiable data subject. That is, there is a known systematic way to re-identify the data subject, which is typically the case for pseudonymized data sets. Class C data is data that contains personal data, but that data is anonymized in such a manner that the data subject is not or no longer identifiable at all. And class D is data sets that contain no information relating to an identifiable, identified or identifiable data subject. A simple example might be just physics data or something that has nothing to do with an actual human being. I already indicated in the table which of these data classes are allowed currently on the Fenix infrastructure, but here I summarize it again on this slide. So class A data, that is data relating to an identified data subject. This data must not be stored at all within the Fenix infrastructure currently. And Fenix users actually have to confirm that they will comply with this rule by signing a user agreement before they get access to the Fenix resources. For class B, pseudonymized, typically pseudonymized data, this data class is allowed on the Fenix infrastructure, but restrictions apply. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the following slide. Class C data, that is anonymized data, that data is allowed on the Fenix infrastructure, but the responsibility for assessing and monitoring if there are known technical means to transform the data such that it would allow to identify the data subject remains with the data controller, that is the Fenix user. And for class D, there's no restrictions, just simply because the GDPR does not apply. I mean, there's at least no restrictions coming from the GDPR. So let's look at the Fenix approach for class B data, that is pseudonymized data. And this figure here shows how this pseudonymized data is handled in the Fenix infrastructure. And first of all, we're talking about data for which a systematic way to re-identify the data subject by combining the pseudonymized data with additional information is known. So, but this data in principle can be stored in a Fenix data repository as indicated here. The Fenix user as the data controller is responsible for storing the additional data outside of the Fenix infrastructure, for instance, at the home institution of the Fenix user. And of course, adequate protection of this additional data is required and is part of the responsibility of the Fenix user as the data controller. The Fenix user is also responsible for protecting the data subject rights, for instance, for managing any consent forms. So that's the responsibilities of the user. But Fenix also, of course, has some responsibilities. For instance, as the data processor, Fenix supports the Fenix user by basically fulfilling its obligations as data processor, including the implementation of appropriate technical and organizational measures to protect the data. Another example is that Fenix monitors the data sets in the infrastructure to minimize the risk of data subjects being re-identified by combining different pseudonymized data sets from the same data source. One could, for instance, imagine that, just to give an example, different pseudonymized data sets coming in to the infrastructure from the UK Biobank, for instance. If there are several of these data sets existing in the infrastructure, it might, at least in theory, be possible to combine them such that that data subjects could be re-identified. So that's the general concept for this class B data, which is special for Fenix in the sense that it kind of marks the current limit up to which personal data can be accommodated in the infrastructure. Before I hand over to Anne, I would like to talk about two additional aspects that are also somehow connected. First of all, data locality. It is important to be aware that the Fenix infrastructure does not guarantee a certain data location, nor does it automatically or do Fenix infrastructure services automatically change data locations. Fenix users must actually specify a certain repository when they upload data to the Fenix archival data repositories, which are federated. The Fenix services support data transfer between federated archival data repositories at different locations, but these transfers must be initiated by a Fenix user. So this does not happen automatically. There's also no services foreseen currently that would result in an automatic geo-redundant replication of data without the explicit involvement of Fenix users. Fenix users does have full control of the geolocation of their data. The next point, my last point, is exceptions for scientific research. the GDPR provides certain allowances for data processing for scientific research purposes. These allowances or exemptions are called derogations under the GDPR, and these vary by member state, and this will likely result in different legal requirements across the EU. You can actually find more on this in the HPP data policy manual. The ICEI infrastructure services do not provide the means of preventing replication of data between archival data repositories located at different sites and thus possibly different countries. Fenix users that upload Class B data must therefore check if a derogation applies to the Fenix site to which the data is uploaded and indicate this in the application process. About which Anna will give you now more details.
Great. Okay, so in the second part of the webinar, I will summarize the current regulations for processing of personal data within the Fenix infrastructure. The current process and regulations are summarized on the Fenix website. You can see the link here. So if you click on Access, you find further information. Apart from datasets not relating to an identifiable data subject and anonymized datasets, personal data that has been pseudonymized, data class B, as Boris explained, can be processed within the Fenix infrastructure. If data belongs to class B, meaning there is a known systematic way to re-identify the data subjects, a certain process needs to be followed before access to the resources can be provided. However, based on recently emerging requirements, especially in regard to brain research, current regulations may change and it may be possible in the future to store and process personal data that belongs to data class A, so data that can be related to an identified data subject. Before going into detail about the process for processing personal data, I would like to introduce you to the most relevant actors in the process. A Fenix user is a natural person who is using resources of the Fenix infrastructure. Importantly, Fenix users who are uploading personal data to the Fenix infrastructure are considered to be the controller of this personal data. Fenix users need to provide information on their home institution to which they are affiliated. For example, a research center or another public authority. They cannot just provide, for example, only an email address from a Google account. A Fenix resource provider is a supercomputing center that provides resources to the Fenix user. And when personal data is uploaded by the Fenix user, as Boris explained, the Fenix resource provider is considered to be the processor of the personal data, whereas the Fenix user is the controller and responsible for protecting data subject rights. Data protection officers, DPOs, have a security leadership role and are responsible for overseeing data protection strategies and their implementation, ensuring GDPR compliance. There is usually one DPO at each research institution. So now I will describe the process which needs to be followed before Fenix users can process personal data within the Fenix infrastructure. Importantly, the required regulations for projects that want to use resources for processing personal data are assessed on an individual basis. So for each project, a specific process is followed where all relevant information and documentation is collected and the regulations for processing of personal data in the context of the respective project are determined. This process is usually initiated in parallel to the usual evaluation and approval procedure for project proposals and is coordinated by the IC Project Management Office. This diagram summarizes the steps of the process, and when it is completed, an approved project can start using the granted resources within the Fenix infrastructure. In the first step, applicants who want to use resources for processing personal data need to indicate this in their resource application. Then the project management office contacts the applicants, the future Fenix user, as well as the Fenix site where the applicant wants to use resources, so the Fenix resource provider, and the project management office asks both to provide relevant documentation. After collecting all the provided documentation, the project management office checks whether it can be considered a complete data protection impact assessment to comply with Article 35 of the GDPR. And if this is complete, the project proposal has also been approved, the project members can start using the resources. Now I would like to explain which documentation needs to be provided for projects that plan to use resources for processing personal data. Fenix users need to provide contact details of their home institution's DPO, a declaration of the DPO that collection and processing of the respective personal data will be carried out according to EU and national legislation. And then, based on GDPR Article 89, which allows derogations from data subject rights if personal data is processed for specific purposes, for example, scientific research purposes, as Boris explained, it must be checked and documented whether any of these derogations apply to the data which is planned to be processed in the context of the respective project. And since, for example, for storing and processing of medical data, EU member states have introduced derogations from individual subject rights and consequential additional safeguards that vary between the different EU member states, it is important that these implications regarding geolocality of the data are also documented. Furthermore, the Fenix user needs to provide a commitment telling that Fenix data repositories will only be used for storing pseudonymized data. And in case the Fenix user is a member of HPP, a commitment to comply with the current version of the HPP data policy manual needs to be provided. Sorry. And then the Fenix resource provider needs to document the security measures that are in place and need to be respected by the Fenix user when processing pseudonymized data. And also a declaration of the respective DPO on compliance and/or authorization that is required under national law. So in this whole process, there are several people from different organizations with different roles involved for providing all relevant documentation. And in the last part of the webinar, I would like to show you an example of a project that is using resources of the Fenix infrastructure and involves processing of personal data. The name, sorry, the name of the project is Virtual Brains of UK Biobank. And the goal of the project is to build predictive models for the health outcome and cognitive functions of UK Biobank participants who agreed that images of their organs, including the brain, are taken, which will allow scientists to study how structure and function are related to the development of these diseases. And sorry, I will drink something.
Don't worry, yes, go ahead. Have some water.
The models are built by running individual brain simulations using the software The Virtual Brain, TVB. And if you would like to know more about the project and the software, or you're interested in using TVB for your research, you find the respective links to further information here on the right. So which kind of personal data is processed in the context of the project? The project processes dephased MRI datasets from UK Biobank participants. And these datasets have been pseudonymized by UK Biobank before releasing them to scientists who need to apply for using them. Reversing the de-identification protocol is possible, but the respective codes remain with UK Biobank, meaning that UK Biobank can contact these participants in case, for example, a project wants to ask a certain participant for additional phenotyping. And when it was assessed which regulations need to be followed in the context of this specific project, it was determined that all data needs to be encrypted in the storage space and when it is transferred to the compute nodes. Only at the time of processing, the data is allowed to be decrypted. And it was also agreed that there is a specific policy for data retention and deletion, which needs to be followed at the respective Fenix site, which is currently CSCS. In case encryption is required for data that is planned to be processed in the context of a certain project that wants to use resources of the Fenix infrastructure, the resource providing site offers an encryption solution and support with the implementation. And of course, if you have any questions as a Fenix user about the process, you can always contact us at the project management office.
Okay, I wanted to say a few words on how to access the Fenix services for potential users. So for neuroscientists, there is the access available through the Human Brain project via the HPP Brains Call. And this is ongoing, so people can apply whenever they prefer. And we also have the Praise ICEI calls for proposals. These come out quarterly, and there will be one that is going to be published very soon. So we will let you know about this on the Fenix website and on the Praise website as well, of course. So these calls are for researchers in need of scalable and interactive computing resources, virtual machine services, and active and archival data repositories, which are the Fenix services. And all details can be found on our access page on the Fenix website. It would be great to give us your feedback for this webinar so that we can collect opinions and questions and improve. And I've already shared the link for the survey in the chat, but this will also be sent to you along with more information via email tomorrow in a follow-up email. And finally, stay tuned with our activities. You can sign up for the Fenix User Forum, which is an online communication platform where we can discuss issues on the Fenix services and resources. You can ask questions about the Fenix infrastructure, and we also share user-dedicated documents, files, presentations, and so on. For any questions, feel free to email us and check our website and our Twitter account. And thanks again to our panelists for these very interesting presentations and for the Q&A. And thanks to all of you for attending today's webinar. And we hope to see you to the next one.